Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Nick Taylor Horror Show. Larry Fessenden is an American director, producer, writer, actor, and overall force to be reckoned with. A true indie film pioneer in the horror world, Larry's career highlights include 1995's gritty vampire drama Habit, 2001's Wendigo, and The Last Winter starring Ron Perelman. Larry's latest movie, Depraved, is a gritty and modern take on Frankenstein, with a number of very interesting questions posed about the ethics of scientific advancements in medicine. Larry's also a very accomplished producer, but beyond that, Larry is one of those rare gentle mentors in the industry who really goes to great lengths to give new directors a head start. Quite a few notable directors have bloomed under Larry's guidance, including Jim Mickle and Ty West. Today, his company Glass Eye Pictures continues to put out uniquely voiced genre films that rock the independent horror world to its core. Larry's a fellow native-born New Yorker, and I really had a wonderful time speaking to him. So without further ado, here's the great Larry Fessenden. How is everything?
Everything's cool.
Good.
We're here at the IFC building.
I know, it's exciting.
I feel in a special room.
Yeah, it's a pretty little pink room. It's very moody. I feel like we're in a sunset right now.
Yeah, or a Kubrick film. I don't know which.
Yes. I feel like we're being thrust into a scene out of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
It's true with these chairs. It's good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So you're a fellow native New Yorker.
Yep, born and raised here.
So how did New York contribute to your film education? I mean, you grew up during a time where there's a lot of great cinema coming out of New York. How did that shape you as a filmmaker?
Oh, it's a great question because, when I was young, which is to say, 12 or 13, I was going to the rep houses. They played a lot of old movies regularly. There was the Thalia, there was the Metro, there was double features unspooling all over the town, and you could go and immerse yourself in the cinema of the old days, like Cary Grant double feature, or recent releases like Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman. I saw that at Cinema Village. So it was great. And then the city itself always spoke to me as a place where you can become anonymous. There was a great grit to it in the 70s, a certain danger factor, but I also loved Central Park. I mean, it's just a fantastic city. I think that's why people are snooty if they came from New York, because they just had this rich experience growing up.
Yeah.
CBGB's was downtown. You could ride the subways and just the whole thing.
I miss CBGB's. I grew up going there. I got kicked out of there when I was really young at one point. My friends and I, we tried to sneak beer in there, but we were so stupid. We brought 40 ounces in there, which they don't serve at the bar. We got booted out of there at 17.
Yeah. I knew Hilly. We played at CB's ourselves, me and my band, and saw some great acts there. Yeah, I mean, it's just a whole culture that is definitely dissipated.
Yeah.
But there's still pockets of it. And I have very strong memories in the early 80s growing up with the performance arts scene, the music scene downtown. I moved downtown to the East Village, and it was just bubbling up and riots. And
Must have been a hell of a time to be in New York.
It was a crazy time, yeah.
Very cool. Well, speaking of CBGB, so punk rock is a big part of the way you seem to approach films. From every interview I've read from you, punk rock inevitably comes up in terms of how you approach the filmmaking process and editing process, but it's also a big part of your upbringing. Could you talk about what punk rock means to you and how you extend the ethos of punk rock into filmmaking?
Well, yeah, and I don't claim to be like a punk aficionado. I grew up on the Clash and the Sex Pistols, but I also like, Simon and Garfunkel. So as far as musical taste, give me Miles Davis and Charlie Parker, Louis Armstrong. So, but punk as a do-it-yourself aesthetic and sticking it to the man, those are the things I think that why I might drop the term in interviews. Of course, also we made The Ranger recently, so it was very particularly relevant. But I really believe in working outside the system. If the system won't have you, make no mistake, I'd be happy to make a large film with Hollywood execs. But until that time, you got to still stand up for the art and make the art with your own hands and get in there and build your own community. Very much that punk aesthetic of like doing it yourself and having a strong engagement with the community.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, particularly from a filmmaking perspective, particularly now in the age that we're in right now. I mean, it seems like with things like video on demand and just the cinematic abundance that a lot of streaming platforms have brought, it's a double-edged sword, but a lot of people can get movies out where in the past they probably wouldn't. They'd be dependent on a studio and they would rely on a theatrical distribution, whereas they don't anymore. And that seems to enable a lot of aspiring filmmakers to be able to get their movies out. But it also floods the market with a lot of projects that are not so great. But what is your take on the current age of where we are in terms of cinema in the context of streaming and all of that?
Well, when I was coming up and started producing movies and sort of enabling other filmmakers as well as my own work, there was this DVD, TV, foreign. There were different marketplaces, so you could sort of imagine getting your money back from a film, even a small film. There was also self-distribution in theaters that had a little more oomph because people went to the theaters.
Right.
Now with streaming, what you always find, I think no matter what the age, is there's still going to be gatekeepers. Like Netflix does not take every movie.
Right.
And they don't even have a lot of my films. And then Shudder used to have a lot of Glass Eye Pics movies, but then actually Shudder grew up too. So the point is that you're still dealing, and then needless to say, festivals, extremely competitive. There's a gazillion movies made. So it's the same relationship you have of being sort of outside the shop, looking in at the candy inside and feeling like you can't quite get your hands on it. And that's why I always say you've got to have a plan B, which has to be building your own community, own reputation. Obviously now with YouTube and streaming, with websites and the internet, you can access people and make them aware of what you have to offer. And in the end, though I think they're great artists who are overlooked, because I've always had an affection for the suffering artist, at the same time, I do think there are ways to get discovered and get your material out there.
Yeah. So one thing I thought that was really interesting that you said about horror is that people who are making horror are the few people who are actually facing reality. Horror as a genre is unflinching when it comes to reality. I mean, it seems to channel our angst as a nation and cultural angst. It's the first genre to do that, and it does so in a very raw, visceral way. And I mean, to that extent, I mean, horror has always been known as kind of a gutter genre. It's in the back with the porn, as you'd said. But since it so unflinchingly faces reality, it's a genre that really matters. I mean, it's above and beyond a gutter genre. What is your take on all of that?
Without a doubt, I appreciate that thought, because that's why horror is a perennial. Every generation has touchstone horror movies that are speaking to their concerns. We had a lot of torture porn, as it was called, say what you want, but movies like Saw and Hostel. And that was when we were in Iraq, and there was sort of a sense of guilt, and like we were being accused of being torturers. I mean, it's really interesting to see the zeitgeist of the times reflected in the horror movies. Of course, when birth control came, you have sort of hippies run wild. That's what Texas Chainsaw Massacre, chopping up the hippies. Rosemary's Baby was also a response to evil children. And obviously Godzilla was a response to the bomb, and all the way back to Frankenstein. And all these are movies that speak to the anxieties and fears of the nation. So yeah, they're the truth tellers. And people, especially in America, we deny death. There's a sort of a fear of facing that fundamental reality, and it's sort of brushed under the rug. And our greatest filmmakers, like or our mainstream filmmakers, even Spielberg always puts a spin on the end of his films to sort of have a little bit of a happy ending, a soft landing.
Right.
And I think horror, though he's a great craftsman of fear, you can't, I think America is in denial, and that's going to get you into a lot of trouble. So horror is there to, like punk rock, to scream at the kids and say, get real. The man is not your friend. How's that for some old-fashioned talk?
Oh, yeah. No, I think it's what the kids need to hear these days.
Kids, come on, get off of your phones and let's get real.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Frankenstein, definitely want to get into talking about Depraved. Really, really enjoyed it a lot. I was one of the lucky few who got to see it at Overlook relatively early.
New Orleans.
Yep. Got to see it first time in New Orleans, which was fantastic. But
Me too.
Yeah, I think your movie was the first one I saw
nice.
at Overlook. Yeah, it was a great way to kick things off. But really very interesting retelling, obviously, of the Mary Shelley Frankenstein mythos. Mm-hmm. I'm curious as to what you felt either hadn't been said in that regard, or what kind of what prompted you to want to do a Frankenstein movie? Because what I thought was interesting about it, which seems to be a common thread in a lot of your films, is you take mythology that we know really well, but you put a very raw, gritty, very grounded, humanity-focused spin on it, in a way that doesn't get too lost in the mythology. The characters have a lot of pathos to them, and there's something very human about it. But you don't dwell too much in either melancholy or melodrama. It's like it's there's a real emotional poignancy to it. So I'm curious what made you want to do a Frankenstein movie, and what inspired it.
I always loved the creature, and I love the makeup. The Karloff makeup from the James Whale film, 1931, just is so iconic. It evokes both pity and fear, which is a pretty cool line to tread. I feel like what I like to do with these horror tropes is sort of personalize them and say, well, what if it was real? And like, how would the Frankenstein story unfold in the modern vernacular? Right. And so I conceived of the doctor being in the endless wars of the Middle East, and he learns really his chops, how to bring people back to life, or some kind of medical prowess that he has, and he comes back, with PTSD and haunted by wartime memories, and just wants to sort of make right of the mess that was over there. Yeah, a so-called unjust war. And so what would he do? Well, he'd hole up in a lab, and he'd get some money from a friend, and he'd figure out how to get some body parts, and maybe he'd try to beat death in the lab. But the true impetus was to personalize the story and say, what is the experience of the creature? And so I feel like what I tried to bring to the story was maybe one of the few movies that tell it from the creature's point of view. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'd wake up in this body and you go, what the hell's going on? There's a Polanski film called The Tenant where he says, if I cut off my arm, I say it's me and my arm. If I cut off my leg, it's me and my leg. If I cut off my head, is it me and my body or me and my head? In other words, where does your sense of self exist? And in the Frankenstein story, is it the brain or is it the body that is carrying the brain around? So, those are just some of the questions that are, they're already in the story, but you kind of, if you come at the material with sort of fresh eyes, you realize, oh, wow, that's so crazy. Like, you'd be a brain, you'd have this weird body that you didn't recognize. You wouldn't know the face in the mirror, but you'd still have the memories. Right. So that kind of conceit, I just marinated on it, and then I just kind of built the story. It's not like I was referencing the book and going back and riffing through the pages. I know the book, I know the movies, and I was just riffing on the setup that Mary Shelley and James Whale had presented. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, the book is one of my favorite books, and the Karloff movie doesn't quite scratch the surface of what happens in the Shelley book, where it really focuses on the creature, and you really empathize with them in a huge way.
Absolutely.
And the De Niro movie tried, which I loved. Nobody liked the De Niro movie, but I thought it was great. Yeah. I enjoyed it a lot. It had a tongue-in-cheek element to it, but it's a good double feature with Coppola's Dracula.
Oh, absolutely. I loved the Dracula, and that has flaws too, which is fine. I mean, there's so much of it that's truly glorious and cinematic, and some of the acting. Of course, Gary Oldman is a revelation. I love that they're different versions of the monster. That's something I cherish. And then the Kenneth Branagh movie, Bobby D. I mean, he was my favorite actor for decades, so it was pretty special that my two worlds came together.
That's cool.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. It has some stature. It's a little goofier because it feels like it a little got out of Kenneth's hands, but it's it's a pleasure, and I can watch it anytime. And the whole way they deal with the bride is really interesting. That is it Elizabeth? I mean, there's something, they play a little with the story there, and it becomes actually more terrifying.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good effort.
Yeah, I was a big fan of it. But in Depraved, you dealt with themes of PTSD, which I thought was really interesting. And this kind of seemed like there was some symbolic notion of cellular memory and being abroad, and then the trauma that comes with, let's just say, physiological being torn apart, and the kind of similar parallel element of that, and the doctor who deals with PTSD. So yeah, I'm curious how the theme of PTSD found its way into Depraved.
Well, as I say, I wrote it in the mid-2000s. I sort of started circling around the story. Of course, I've been thinking about it on and off before then, but just because I like the idea of, like, how would you update all these stories that I love. So, but at the time we were in the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and responding to 9/11, and just generally over there. And I was wondering, like, what a doctor would have to deal with. And I feel that the soldiers come back after these wars that don't have a definitive mission and don't have a beginning and a middle and an end. We're fighting a terrorist entity that you can't really say, well, they've surrendered. So there's a mellifluousness to it that made it very hard to come back and be welcomed, and sort of a job well done. So I think there's an unfinished business aspect that would haunt you, and I think that's what does happen to our soldiers. So I'm thinking about the reality, like you were saying, the actual realities of the military experience, and thinking about how that would play into a fiction story, and how the fiction story is sitting there waiting to receive this very real content, real problems. Also, it's funny because it's not directly, but there's a lot of head trauma in the Iraq wars because of the bombs on the roadside, and people would get their head jostled. And because medicine is so sophisticated, they can come back, they're alive, but they've had their brain rattled, and so they have real problems. These are the modern soldiers, I'm saying. And, and somehow that seemed to fit into the soup of the whole idea of the brain and all these themes that you see in Frankenstein. Because James Whale, that film is where the whole idea of the criminal brain discovered in the laboratory by Hunchback Man, all of that was introduced and has become part of the mythology. I assure you, Mary Shelley did not come up with that crap.
Probably not. So as a producer, you're kind of like a Roger Corman figure in how you're birthing a lot of really, really great other directors like Jim Mickle and Ty West. So what is the kind of Larry Fessenden school of filmmaking? What do you think that you're giving these directors that's enabling them later down the line?
Really just a sense of genuine enthusiasm for the craft and the problem solving that film is, and the minutia of the effect of a wide shot versus a close up, why a dolly shot is essential even though we can't afford it. What can you do to get a crane shot since we can't afford that? Well, I know a guy down the road with a cherry picker, and maybe on Saturday we can use them. I mean, I love just the practical reality of making movies outside, with a smaller budget, when you have to be creative and solve problems sort of more like in the real world, as if you're building a shed in the backyard. And I believe very passionately in the language of cinema, so it's not for one moment do you compromise. You see, just because you don't have the money, you figure out how to get the image that tells the story the way you want to tell it, without maybe all the resources and bells and whistles. Well, do you really need a Steadicam? What's wrong with being a good handheld operator? Now, Steadicam has its own language, and so if the guy says, no, I want that floating feeling, then you go, okay, as long as it's not indulgent. So I found myself hooking up with various like-minded people who were early in their career, so they understood no budget. They understood the sacrifice of caring is your greatest currency. And so we were able to make early films. Now, all of them have graduated and become hotshots, and now they have the budgets and the cranes, and that's great. And you can see the work is still good. And I'm proud to have been sort of their training ground. I really like working with people who are still hungry enough that they'll work for very little. Now, all of this implies that I don't want the tools of cinema, and that's not true. I mean, I love all the options and the equipment that you can use. I love cleaning up your movie with CGI where it's needed. So there's nothing I'm opposed to. But I also believe you can tell great visceral stories and embrace the lack of funds and turn that into your asset.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it works for horror particularly
Absolutely.
well. And the best, most quintessential example is Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yep.
But when you have a stripped down lo-fi aesthetic, it serves horror so well because it's more visceral because it looks like it's like somebody like Texas Chainsaw looked like it was done with a camcorder. And that makes it hit so much harder. But I feel like a lot of what you're saying speaks to the importance of resourcefulness as an independent filmmaker. And I didn't go to film school, but from everything I've heard about film school, they don't really teach you resourcefulness, so to speak. So where did you get this ethic of resourcefulness, and how do you teach it the directors that you produce? Well,
the directors come to me because they sort of see what we've done. And then, you know, I can sense simpatico or not. I mean, what I find is that a lot of the kids that come out of the schools, they're sort of aware of contracts and they're aware of the professionalism. But I remember we were auditioning crew members for a movie, and the conversation was never about what their skills were and how they loved the cinema. It was about the contracts and the hours. And I just felt this is a bad direction. And that seems to be what they're teaching at some of these schools. I'm not going to name names, but so, I mean, you know, obviously these people need professional skills so they can make their way in this business. It's a business after all. And I don't resent that, but I don't also want to lead with that. And we have to be making, the first thing you're doing is you're making art. You're trying to contribute to the culture and have ideas out there. Otherwise, I don't really see the point. I mean, you can get into the industry and make a living wage sewing costumes or all the way up to directing, of course. But I'm certainly trying to find people who really have a singular vision. They want to advance ideas and advance the language of film and do something special that will resonate and then be memorable. And, you know, even Ty West's early film, The Roost, I mean, these are cool movies. You can see craftsmanship in play. And that just excites me. That's what I'm interested in. Other people can create a vocational school, and that's fine too.
Right. But you're looking for people you're looking for that palpable passion, not people who are looking at hours and saying, well, you're going to have to pay me overtime if we do this. But the people are like, let's work all night because we're making art.
And, you know, the other side of the bargain is that as a producer, I don't abuse people. I work a 12-hour day, 10-hour day, whatever it is. That's my side of the bargain. And that's important too. And if I do mentor producers, it's rarely talked about because it's not as glamorous. But the fact is that I work with a lot of great producers, Brent Kunkel, Peter Polk, Jen Wexler. They all came up through Glass Eye. And, you know, it was often a lark, but they learned, you know, the paperwork and the aesthetic that you recycle on set, that you don't endanger people, that you treat people with respect, and you get the most out of everybody because they feel they're part of a family or a cohesive group. And so there's a whole aesthetic of living and working that is beyond the filmmaking. It's about how a society should be built. Not to get lofty too quick, but this is the point. You know, it's just movies after all. As Hitchcock would say, it's only a movie. So you have to be also living in the journey. It's not just the destination. So in the journey, you treat people well and you build, you know, people have dignity no matter what they're, I was saying earlier that the PAs on the last film I made were just fantastic. I mean, they were essential. They were the foot soldiers, and they were making the movie happen. So the rest of the people, the lofty, big idea people, could you know, have the space to do their work. So it's all it's about community and respect, I think.
That's huge. It's really huge.
Yeah.
And you seem to revel in working with first-time directors. And what I'm curious about is obviously first-time directors, having not directed before, they probably come with a lack of preconceived notions of what directing and filmmaking should be. And that's got to be refreshing. I'm sure they bring completely and totally different viewpoints that probably come out of left field, but are really interesting. So I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned as a filmmaker from some of the directors that you've mentored?
Well, a lot of it is just you're feeding off of their passion, and they do have maybe even naive sense of how things should go down. And really, the thing is to try to create the space so that their ideas and their approach can flourish while gently explaining that that's not going to work.
Right.
I mean, one of the classic things, and I do this too, is, I'm going to shoot in order because, and it's fun to say, that's fantastic, and I get it, and I think that's probably worth trying. But just so you know, if we can't shoot in order, there's other benefits, because that means that your first scene isn't the first day you're on set with your crew.
Right.
Maybe that scene is going to stumble a little because you're finding your way. So actually shooting the middle scene on the first day, it could be a good thing. So let's not, you're just trying to use your experience to remind them that actually, though I appreciate deeply your passion on this, let's remember there's another way to look at it.
Right. Same
with coverage. They may say, I always wanted this shot from here. It's all part of the design of the movie. And you go, you know what? You already have the performance that you're going to use. So maybe we don't get that shot that you dreamed about, but we just move on to the next thing. So we have a little more time to do the next thing. You see? So those are things you can offer. Mm-hmm. Because you have the experience of knowing. I have a movie called No Telling. I have 3 crane shots. They must have taken a day each shot, or they're all cut out of the movie. Doesn't mean you don't dream of a crane shot, but just, you can offer that experience to a young filmmaker and say, this is actually what might happen.
Right.
So let's not, for one thing, get depressed if you don't get something, because there may be another way to get it.
So it's that kind of gentle mentorship.
That's right.
Acknowledging their instincts to have these ideas and ambitions, but still gently guiding them towards a better way.
That's right. And it's not even a better way. It's maybe a way to get it done. There's a funny story. I'll be quick. On Stakeland, we shot in 2 sections. Jim Mickle. It felt like we'd used 3/4 of the budget to shoot half the movie. And I said, Jim, we've got to pare down on our coverage. We can't shoot from every angle because we're just losing time. And he came to me sometime later and he said, man, best advice. That's so fantastic. So I have in mind this scene that takes place in the town. We're going to do it in 1 take. And I was like, oh my God, that's going to be twice as complicated. That's not what I was saying. So we did this very elaborate single take, and it's great in the movie. And we did figure out how to sort of invisible divided up.
Right.
But it was funny. There's an example where you're mentoring somebody and they're not hearing you at all. But, as a result, something fantastic happened, and so be it.
That's cool. Yeah, I love Stakeland. Stakeland was really, really cool.
That's a great movie.
Yeah, it's a great
movie. That was a perfect blend of Jim Mickle having he'd worked in the crew of some movies. So he had a lot of friends, crew members who joined him on his first outing as a director, and Glass Eye was able to, use those resources. So that's the thing. As producers, you're always trying to find, where's the path of least resistance that's going to help us make this movie. Like we shot the first half of Mickle's movie on his father's farm.
Oh, cool.
So, very often we'll shoot stuff at my farm, but that's not always possible. And so here was another example. So that's how you make low budget films. You use those opportunities.
Right. Like Robert Rodriguez says, structure a film around what you have immediate access to, which
Absolutely.
is what he did with El Mariachi. And Kevin Smith did that with Clerks. Yeah.
Yep.
Really
that's
smart.
how you do it.
So as a father, I'm curious as to what your son's film education looked like when you were exposing him to movies, and what movies you chose for him, and also his filmmaking education.
Well, I showed him all of Hitchcock when he was like 10 years old. So,
cool.
And we'd watch them, and I'd say, look how he shot that scene. Do you realize that you don't even see that the house is, that the factory is burning? He just shows a wall. And then he shows the smoke coming through. And I said, he's saving a lot of money. He didn't need to show the factory burning. So little things like that. I was not trying to train my kid to be a filmmaker. I was trying to train him to see the language of film unfolding and how choices affect your experience.
Yeah.
So we watched, Miyazaki and Pixar, and it's not like there was some training ground, but at the same time, we watched all the Hitchcocks,
right?
Because Hitchcock is so you can really see his design, and therefore it's fun to talk about a Hitchcock movie, and also they're entertaining.
Yeah.
My kid was watching the Harry Potter films as they came out, which is a great privilege, and he was watching Lord of the Rings. So, just a regular kid. But the thing that was cool is that the way we presented movies in our household, they were never a babysitter. It was never like, Daddy has to go do something important, so here, you just put a video in. No, it was like, and now we're going to watch this movie. And he would always be there, and he'd watch all the way to the end of the credits while his friends were like drooling in the corner playing with blocks,
Right.
So in that sense, I think we taught him just some reverence. And he saw all the 70s movies that I loved, when he was like, by the time he was 15. In fact, now he's like, I've already seen Marathon Man, but I'll look at it again and, have a new experience. So maybe I pushed everything a little too fast, but that was my excitement. And he really got it. He liked movies like Straight Time or just unexpected good films from the olden times.
Yeah.
Also, he was never afraid of black and white because that was mixed right in, Cary Grant, Fred Astaire, Miss Marple, all kinds of stuff. The thing was to have a sense of treating film as an experience and not as a babysitter.
Yeah.
I have that in Depraved. I have the doctor kind of getting bored of his task as being a father, and eventually just gives the monster a tablet and says, and you can watch this. I'm not scolding people who are overworked and have to do something with their kids, but to me, it's a disservice to the medium, let alone the kid.
That's really cool. And then your son Jack went on to direct a movie when he was 16 years old.
Yes.
What did that? How do you direct a movie when you're in high school?
Well, he made like 4 shorts, and they were all too long and they're cool. His first one is a zombie movie, which I love, and it's really about 2 kids who are in the afterworld, and the zombies are around, but they're just bickering about what kind of soda they like. And, so it's, once again, it's sort of taking the naturalism of everyday life, but there's something very, very big out there that they have to deal with. So, I love this approach, and it's a cool movie, and it played at the Woodstock Film Festival, but it was half an hour long. And then he made another couple of movies. They're always about friendships that are trying to find their way. And his mother said, well, for Christ's sake, you keep making these half-hour movies. You might as well make a feature because no one's going to accept a half-hour short.
Right.
And of course, a week later, he came to us and he says, well, I have the feature. And we're like, oh my God. So that's really how it began. And then I read the script and I was very taken with it. And, Beck Underwood, who's my wife, and his mother, she was, she really felt that there needed to be more work. So they worked on the script, and I, oversaw like any producer. And then we discussed the shots, and I made him shot list the entire movie because I said, whether you start with a close-up or a wide shot is the choice of the scene. And so I mentored him, and we had enough reference to other movies that he could understand that these were important choices, and that's how a story gets told. And so we built the film, and then my wife found the car. We shot it at my friend's trailer. So you see, it was that Rodriguez idea.
Yep.
Like, these are all things we have. So
Yeah.
we made it for, I don't know, $50,000, $60,000.
Nice.
We had real actors who I had to pay through SAG, so there were certain expenses. But otherwise, we all lived in the house, and it was, I think, very magical for everybody because this is the sweet spot. It's hard to hit, actually, with most directors, but it was such a family affair.
Yeah.
My wife was the art director. it really was like, okay, let's go put on a show, and we're going to drive to Annie's house, and we're going to get in the trailer and
so cool.
make the movie. And the actors I'd worked with before, so we were all pals, and
Yeah.
it was truly handcrafted. And, you know, a lot of friends are like, you know, oh, you made Jack's movie for him. Well, actually, he was boss. He's a much tougher director than me. I'm very sappy and always listening to people's opinions, but he's very determined. He's an only child, so he's just a little spoiled kid. He told everybody what's what, and I was the DP, so I knew I was very protective of the choices we had made when he designed the movie. I would ask him questions. Why would you start that way? And he'd explain why, and I go, fantastic. And then I was able to protect that vision and do what he had said. He made choice. What's cool is he became a man. He became a filmmaker when he took the camera because he's in the movie. Okay. But there's some scenes where he's not in it. And that's when he took the camera, and he always says that's when he became a filmmaker.
Interesting.
Because he got to change the focus himself,
right?
Choose the lens, choose the moves. And I think that's where he actually got the bug. Up till there, he was sort of on some weird ride. You know, this is something we did as father and son is, you know, you run around and in your Lord of the Rings costume and I'll film and you'll see, we'll edit it and that'll be a movie. But now he actually was making it himself and he really felt the difference.
Wow, what a film school.
Yeah, it's true. And now we made another one. But he was always on film sets and working with the art department, my wife, and so he's seen it all.
That's great. That's really great.
Yeah, it's lucky. That's a privilege.
Yeah.
You know, and yet it's not Hollywood, so it's not like he goes and sees his father being a big shot. He's literally seeing us like we're down building the props for Glenn's movie or something.
Right.
You know,
he learns every ounce of the craft of it that way.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Cool. So last few questions. What are you working on now and next?
Well, I'm tucking Depraved into bed. You know, I got to do the making ofs and just tend to all that. Mm-hmm. And then I shot my son's second film this summer. It was a very, very ambitious, very fast, and quite exhausting. So that was brutal. And now, of course, I'm nervous and overseeing, waiting for him to edit. You know, he's in college again. So I'm like, now, what do you got? Well, you're editing, right? So that's a thing to manage. And then I have a couple of scripts. Usually I like to and I think eventually I'm just going to choose what I really want to work on and then try to make it. It takes forever. Yeah. But I like, we made a couple movies low budget now, and I'm going to sort of stick to that. It's too hard to knock on Hollywood's door and try to engage a big actor. I mean, I would love that. I'm not sure if that's in the cards for me. So it's hard enough to find a very small amount of money. Mm-hmm. But I think Depraved has proved that I at least know how to make films. And so try to seize on a little of that energy, because it's been like 6 years between each film, and that's not going to work for me. I'm too old. I'm not going to be around that much longer.
Gotcha. Is there anything you've wanted to do either as an actor, producer, or director that you haven't got a chance to do yet that you've been wanting to do?
Well, yeah, be famous and make big movies. I mean, what do you think the answer is? I mean, my heroes are like Scorsese and not really. I mean, Spielberg is a hero. I like his filmmaking and, you know, but just the vast. I mean, Marty's the best example because he really does make his religious, thoughtful pictures. He makes his gangster movies. Then he does a history film like The Aviator. It's all very personal, and yet he's able to jump around genres. And then I like that Herzog makes narratives and documentaries. So the real thing is, the only dream that is to do more. Yeah. And yet, quite honestly, at the same time, I'm so disgusted with humanity and the business and this culture that part of me wants to do less and make furniture, which is what I really like to do.
Interesting.
So I'm very conflicted, as you can see. I just assume retire, which would save me money. Somehow making movies is very costly.
Are there any either of resources or books that were particularly formidable to you, or that you recommend the directors that you kind of check out?
Yes, I'll tell you. I'll give you three. First of all, you have to watch and then read Hitchcock Truffaut. This is the greatest book on filmmaking, not because you have to like Hitchcock, but because he explains his intention in every shot and you really get to understand. And then, the cool thing is he talks about every movie, everything from the casting to the art direction, of course, to the camera.
Yeah.
And then, he talks about his tricks and all his usual sort of self-aggrandizement, but it's a great education. And you have the pleasure of watching the movie and then you can read 6 or 7 pages about it. Then I recommend Sidney Lumet's book, Making Movies. Lovely book by a great director, really thoughtful, and just a nice glimpse into process.
Yeah.
And then I might recommend In the Blink of an Eye by the editor of The Godfather and the sound designer of The Godfather, Walter Murch. And he has so much insight as to editing. And some of these guys are, old school and there's sort of more poetry involved in their thinking, but poetry is good.
Right.
So he talks about, my favorite thing is this: if you're editing a scene and when the actor blinks, that's very often where there should be an edit, because the actor sort of puts a close on an idea and it's sort of an invitation to say, okay, I've done that idea. I'm blinking now. I'm sort of resetting. Yeah. And it's often a clue as to where you might want to do an edit. I love that. So these kind of insights, very strange, very, very helpful, and a great reverence for the art of film, which is fun to read people who care.
Interesting. Yeah. Great. Larry, this was a tremendous honor. Thank you very much.
Great.
Any parting wisdom for aspiring filmmakers?
None at all. Just hang in there or find something much easier to do.
Great. On that note, thank you again. This was great.
Certainly. Thanks. Thank you.
All right. I really loved that conversation. Larry is so awesome. So here is a summary of key advice from this conversation with Larry Fessenden. Number 1, find a cast and crew who are in it for the passion. When making independent films, the pay is low and the hours are grueling. Therefore, it's critical that you find people who want to be a part of your movie for the right reasons. The right reasons being the desire and drive to create. The people you want to work with will be more concerned about the project and their creative contributions and less concerned about their contracts, hours, and overtime. That being said, the other side of this is that you cannot abuse or take advantage of them whatsoever. As an indie director, you have to hold up your end of the bargain by ensuring that your cast and crew is always respected, safe, and listened to. All of these elements are what make a creative and cohesive family unit on set. The spirit of independent filmmaking thrives on perseverance, not just from the director, but from everyone around him. Find people who will willingly remain in the trenches with you and treat them like gold. Number 2, embrace the punk rock ethos of filmmaking. As Larry says, work outside of the system if the system won't have you. This is largely why he embraced the DIY, do-it-yourself ethos of punk rock when he produced his films. This stresses the importance of working outside of the system and not constantly waiting around for someone to give you clearance and permission, but creatively finding a way to get the shots yourself with what you have access to. Which brings me to my next point. Number 3, embrace the challenge. Larry mentioned how the fun of making independent movies is finding a way to get the shots without having the resources. Again, this speaks to how important the quality of resourcefulness is in directors and filmmakers. This partially requires taking a mental inventory of everything you have access to whenever you face a production challenge. Larry mentioned how on one movie he needed a crane shot that he couldn't afford, but remembered that he had a neighbor with a cherry picker, so he got the shot that way. Nearly everyone has unexpected advantages and access to unique resources. Discover what yours are and structure your script around them. Number 4, face your fears. Larry's noted for saying that horror is the only genre that unflinchingly faces reality. It's been widely documented that trendy horror genres throughout the years are effective because they serve as metaphors for current anxieties. Godzilla came from the fear of the atomic age, torture porn rose during a culture of disgust over military mistreatment of foreign POWs, etc., etc. The level of unflinching honesty that horror directors are able to achieve when confronting real fears and social anxiety anxieties is one of the reasons why horror matters so much as a genre. Larry's advice is to really confront and face your own fears and sources of unrest and channel them into your work. The more honest you are about what scares you, the more your work will resonate with people on a gut level and the more effective the horror element will be. As Larry says, denial is dangerous. The horror genre is there to remind us of reality and hard truths. Anyway, guys, thank you as always for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, it would mean the world to me if you could give us a positive review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if there is another director you think we should have on the show, send me a tweet or a message on Instagram at I'm Nick Taylor. That's I am Nick Taylor. Thanks again for listening to the Nick Taylor Horror Show.